Anyways, just want to show the agenda and say that at the beginning of the meeting, we do have 5 minutes for news and updates. So as part of this chatter, if anyone has anything they want to share, any new activities going on within the sample realm, or also as we've been doing now, introducing new folks, now's the time. So if anyone has anything like that, like to share.
There's one thing that I didn't plan to share this, but it comes to mind. I don't know if this is a community y'all would want to reach out to, but the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, Spinach, their abstracts are due on the 28th, and that might actually, it might be worth a poster. I am planning on submitting for a different project, so I don't know, that's something to put on the radar. It is in Scotland in July. So that
we're definitely going to submit something about ice samples.
Cool,
the
great
project. So that's in the planning. I wasn't sure, Sarah, you want to say anything about the Sampling Nature Research Coordination Network, or should we keep that for?
Well, we did, for those of you who are not aware, we do have an RCN from NSF called Sampling Nature, which is meant to bring together community around samples, but with 4 distinct working areas and working groups. We gave a presentation about sampling nature at the previous ESIP meeting, so I encourage you to go back and look at that recording for a brief overview. But I wasn't sure, Kirsten, if we don't have anything at this time as far as next workshops or the kickoff of the working groups yet, but if there's any interest in collaboration around metadata, policies, training materials.
We're going to be looking for members of the working groups, sorry, he just doesn't go away. Sorry. So especially the metadata working group and the policies around sample access, care principles, and so on. Those are the 2 working groups that we're putting priority on at the moment in the near future.
Okay, I'm just putting this stuff in the notes. But to go back to your point, Andrea, I think it would be good maybe as we make progress with the guidelines, which we'll talk about in more depth later in the session, that might be a place to put our preliminary work to get either reviewer feedback or just to next adopters. So I'd say let's bring that back up at the end of the meeting when we talk about next steps.
Awesome, that sounds great.
Does anyone have anything else they want to share? Let me check the chat. Nope, just talk about cats and travel. All awesome things, right? Okay. If there's any other news, if not, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is a presentation and discussion from Steve Richards on the eye samples.
Turn my video on. And
do you want me to?
Screen.
Okay. Yeah, I can stop sharing. I can figure out how. There we go.
Okay, let's go over here. So I don't know if this is a couple slides from the poster that's in the research forum, but what we've been working on in eye samples is a description schema for physical samples that's applicable to material samples from the various partner systems we're working with, which cover a fairly broad spectrum of different domains. So we're working with Open Context, which is an archaeology information system, Geome, which has a lot of genomic samples, Cesar, which earth science samples, and then with the Smithsonian, mostly dealing with biological collections from the Smithsonian. So the process we went through to compile a metadata scheme to describe samples in this context is to look at the actual sample descriptions that were coming from these various sources, and then look at other related models like IGSN, of course. GeoSciML has models, and what's being used in Cesar. There's an ODM2 sample model. The TADWIG working group has a material sample working group. and the SNN, the semantic sensor network work group in the W3C also has. So we've looked at these various sample descriptions. And broadly, a couple aspects of the scheme we've come up with is, first of all, what are the identifiers? So there's two important identifiers. One is the identifier for the actual physical sample itself. So that's the IGSN would identify the actual physical thing. And then we have the thing in the information system, which is this metadata record that describes the sample. And there's a DISCO working group. I forget what the DISCO acronym stands for, but it's another group in Europe that's working on what they call a digital specimen, which is basically the metadata record about a sample. And so these two things both have identifiers, but on the web, they would resolve to the same description. The representation of the physical sample is the metadata record on the web. So they resolve to the same place. So there's the identifier for the record and the identifier for the sample. The basic sample description information that we're looking at, or the identifier, there's some kind of label for the sample to identify the sample for people. This might be the original sample identifier that was assigned when it was collected, but it also might be some kind of concatenated string of sample type and material and an identifier, something like that. But the idea is it's something that people will be able to use to recognize the sample. And then a physical description of the sample, just free text. And then there are three basic controlled vocabularies that we're using. Uh-oh, how'd that happen? Yeah. Oh, I know, I was trying to get rid of that. There we go. That apply to all the kinds of samples. So that deal with three important questions about the sample. So what is it? And there's a controlled vocabulary describing the specimen type. What is it composed of? What's the material type? And then what is the sampled feature? And the sampled feature is important just because conceptually our definition of a sample is that it's a physical entity that is representative of some entity in the world that we're interested in, whether it's a biological population or a particular plant or a rock formation or a mineral or something like that. So there's a sampled feature type. And we've developed three high-level vocabularies for describing these. And then the other core properties to help with discovery are just being able to assign keywords. Then additional things that are important for samples are the sampling event, which is a sort of composite property that deals with where was the sample collected, how was it collected, who did it, when was it collected, the curation, where's the sample now, is it accessible, has it been modified in any way since it was collected, and then relationships to other resources. The other important part is because we're dealing with such a broad spectrum of domains, the scheme needs to be extensible. So there's 2 points of extension, one of which is to add other properties as key value pairs, and then to have domain-specific categories for classifications that are more specific than the broad generalizations that we have in the three top-level vocabularies. So these might be things like rock type, biological taxon, cultural context for archaeology samples. So for the physical samples cluster here, I think one of the important points that we're interested in is, I know you're working on how samples would be cited, and I think it's important thinking about this for iSamples. We want to make sure that this metadata scheme has all the necessary information for a sample citation. So I'm not exactly sure where things stand on that citation, but I assume that the sample label and identifier would be part of that citation. But I'm also guessing there might be something about the curation or sample location. So we're interested in getting some feedback on whether within this metadata scheme, are there properties that should be considered mandatory in order to enable the sample citation? Oh, Kirsten, thanks for DISCO is Digital Information System for Scientific Collections. There we go.
It's actually now distributed. Sorry, I corrected it.
Distributed information system?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay, for scientific collections. Yeah, so they're wrestling with a very similar kind of problem, and we've been participating in some of the discussions with them, as well as with the Tadwig work group, which is overhauling some of the language. Particularly, there's a work group that's been working on the definition of material sample, and I think just yesterday they finally reached some agreement on the idea that the physical material, they're calling material sample, would be defined as a physical entity that is meant to be representative of some physical entity of interest in the world, something along those lines. But this idea that what makes a physical object a sample is this relationship with something in the world that we're interested in learning about, making observations, making measurements. One other thing I wanted to jump onto, let's see, so we have to, let me see if this works. How do I get out of, there we go, got to switch. So I mentioned these 3 vocabularies, and I just wanted to point out something of interest. So we've been in the iSamples work we've done so far, we've been harvesting metadata from our partner systems, and so far we have about 6 million records that we've harvested. And we've been looking at the statistics of how these 3 high-level vocabularies have been getting used. And an observation is that for like the material category, we have, basically more than half the records that we've harvested don't have a material category that we've been able to categorize based on the information we've harvested using the vocabulary we have. Whereas the specimen category, well, there's an awful lot of other solid objects. So again, more than half, and things tail off. And then likewise, the context category, this is the sampled feature categorization. Again, we have an awful lot of records. So we have these 3 high-level vocabularies, but we're seeing a lot of records that we're harvesting that don't have information in the metadata we're getting that allows us to map it into our high-level vocabularies. So this raises some questions. I mean, does this mean, are these vocabularies not very useful? The idea of having them was to be able to build facets and things in a search interface that would allow people to narrow down. I mean, in our aggregator, right now we've just started, we have 6 million samples in there. So you can imagine running up, searches can yield huge numbers of results. And having these facets for these high-level categories would provide a means to narrow those down.
So speaking of narrowing things down, sorry, we've only got a few more minutes for this time frame, and you've got a lot of content shared, which is really great and exciting, but we've already got a question. So
yeah.
Maybe.
Oh no, this is actually, I just have the rest of the slides in the stack there in case anybody wanted to look at it. I'm not going to go through all that stuff, sorry.
Okay.
Sigh of relief, right? So yeah, so if there's questions, let's switch to questions, comments, thoughts.
Andrea asked, how do you handle the sampled from property for whole specimens? For example, a fossil or a complete bone or something like, I think she's referring to like a part sample, part of something sampled from.
This is a niche question. I don't know if other people care about this, but I'm just wondering how you would do you always have to say a sample is something that's sampled from something else, or is that like an optional property?
Well, the idea is that if it's a sample of something.
I see. Okay.
Would you does that throw red flags for you?
Well, it makes me think that there's a difference between a sample and a specimen, and if this is a tangent, please tell me and we can stop talking about it. But for the purposes of I'm interested in specimen citation also, so that's why I ask.
Interesting. Okay, so this is in the Tadwig meeting yesterday. Yeah. There was a discussion of well, you were there, right?
I wasn't, but I'm sure that there was. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I'm interested in maybe nobody else is, but I am. What the distinction you make between a sample and a specimen? How do you make that distinction?
Because my orientation is largely out of the vert paleo. So where you're talking about a specimen as in a whole bone that you found in the ground or something like that, whereas a sample would be something something taken out for radiocarbon testing or similar.
Okay, so the sample would be derived from the specimen.
Yeah, in my universe though, and I know other people think of it differently.
Right. Okay. So I think the way we've been thinking about it, we would say the bone itself was also a sample.
Okay.
And that then, so, and I mean, in the relationship part of the metadata, one of the key relationships is a parent sample.
Yeah. Okay.
So the extract would have a parent sample that would be the bone.
Yeah.
And one of the questions in terms of doing this then is the, for the derived sample, is it a sample of the same thing that the bone is a sample of, or is it a sample of the bone? And that's sort of a subjective call, and it has a lot to do with the intention of what kind of research you're doing. I think that's where it's hard to dictate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes sense.
I know I've heard other distinctions between sample and specimen made in that a sample has a sampled feature, whereas a specimen is just an example of something. So you can have like a specimen of iron or a specimen of copper, right? And it's, it's not from some particular place. It's just an instance of some substance or something that you have a representative piece of. But it's a debatable distinction whether how useful that is. Were there any other questions, comments, thoughts? So
Steve,
yeah, Kirsten.
One thing that I think we need to take into account in certain cases are permits and how samples were collected in the context of the care principles especially. And I know that some of the agencies like the USGS is very concerned about demonstrating that samples were collected ethically and with the right permit. So it can become, I think, something critical.
Yeah, and so currently, I guess what our thinking in the iSamples is that would be information. The sampling event includes information about who, how, where, when, and the where would be the sampling site, and attached to the site, I think, is where the place where you'd want to say, what kind of restrictions are there on that site from cultural or whatever points of view, property ownership, whatever. Go ahead. But we haven't actually implemented any of that in iSamples yet, because again, it's one of those things that we're generally not getting in the metadata that we're harvesting.
It relates to the question that Adam just put into the chat about the precision of location, because that can sometimes be, a problem to report exact locations or having to report exact locations.
Right. And so again, this is of course a question that's come also with you, and some locations are spoofed on purpose. And so one suggestion there is that you provide a point and which is, basically say, this point is, the location accuracy is 2 kilometers or 5 kilometers or something like that, and just say, the sample was collected somewhere near here. But you don't, so you truth in advertising, you say, well, this is not an exact location, it was somewhere around here, kind of thing, or just say the location can't be reported, I suppose, is an option as well. So that gets tricky. And again, it's not something, a lot of the stuff we're getting, we don't have location information for anyway. Yeah.
It goes to precision, I think, too, because that came up a lot when I worked at the Florida Geological Survey of older samples where the location was perhaps a mailbox or a point that no longer existed, and where you could estimate perhaps what the location was, but you didn't know the precision to begin with. And so precision might be a way to capture that fuzziness of it's purposely not precise.
That's exactly what I just put in the chat.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, I'm glad we're in agreement. As best you can do, as long as you can tell me how precise you're being.
Right.
Yeah, for historical collections, you're going to be talking about like kilometers or tens of kilometers. Like it's just not going to be.
Yeah.
It's going to be very imprecise.
But that's okay. I mean, isn't that how it is for any analysis? As long as you tell me what your error bars are.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I think it makes more sense. I think like the georeferencing stuff makes more sense for biological collections. I think because rocks, like even from the same point, could theoretically vary across stratigraphy quite a bit. Like it's just kind of weird. Like you get these huge error bars sort of in two directions. And we often don't even have like stratigraphic units in the Smithsonian collection. It just makes it hard to imagine what we would assign an ultimate parent to any of our samples would be.
In the location or the sampled feature?
This is like if you have a rock sample, like what's a rock sample? Like if you have a biological specimen, like everything traces back to, like all the different parts of a specimen might trace back to a single specimen. But if you have a rock, it's just like a specimen, it's a sample of, you know, like a cliff or something, or an outcrop.
Right.
But we don't necessarily, like, what's it a sample of ultimately?
Right. Good point, Leslie.
This is great, but I think it also wraps very tidily into our first breakout session.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one note that we had discussed this in the iSamples project, that perhaps if there was good discussion and debate here, that we schedule a follow-up meeting to focus on some of these discussions. And so I'm seeing Val nod because that's the only person I'm seeing right now, but I'm assuming there's other support for that. And so if you add your name to the meeting notes, and if it's all right, we'll contact those of you who've attended this meeting to follow up, perhaps to have a more in-depth conversation on this topic of vocabularies with the iSamples group.
Great. All right. Well, thanks.
All right, so I'm gonna, if you could stop sharing your screen, Steve, I'll go back and put the slides up for the breakout activity. Val, do you want to take lead on this or do you want me to?
It doesn't matter to me. Yeah, but I think, yeah, so we're gonna go into some breakout sessions here, but before we do that, we want to kind of go over the motivations and where this is coming from and where we're going here. So next slide. Yeah. So generally what we're talking about here is that we want to work towards sample citation, but how and how do we do this in a useful manner at this time? And we've been talking about this in a lot of different monthly calls and things. But what would be great?
Do you want me to show what we've got so far?
That sounds good.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm working on a very tiny screen.
Yeah, so I guess it came up from one of the earlier ESIP sessions that we held of, we asked for what does the community want to work on? And this topic of recommendations for citing and sharing samples was a priority topic. And so we've been working on it for a little while, and that's sort of where it came out of the demands and the interest of this community. And we've gone through several different iterations of what that looks like and what that means. And we've been using our monthly meetings to move forward on that. And we came up with ultimately a template and some suggested topics. And then and this might be a good opportunity now to switch gears and go back. We were approached by Shelley Stulls at AGU to say, hey, we have this other document that we've been working on, and if you do your guidelines similar to how we're doing our guidelines, we could potentially adopt it. I think Chris is here. I don't think Shelley is. Chris, do you want to say something briefly about that, and not to put you on the spot?
Yeah, I actually, since I've only been at AG for a year, hello, but I know that samples have been part of the conversation all along as we've been developing. We just haven't had the information from you, but we did want to integrate it, and we integrated what we could at the time. So this guidance that you see before you is sort of streamlined guidance. It was all over the AGU site. And so we sort of centralized it in one place and made it more succinct about what people should be doing. And on that page is actually what I think you referred to, Sarah, which is the extended guidance, which lives on GitHub actually. So anything that you propose, can actually be submitted as an issue or pull request, which we can incorporate into the guidance. But one particular things to highlight here is that I think you're pursuing a persistent identifier, which is great. That ultimately is invaluable because that's what gets actually indexed through Crossref, and that allows people to sort of access the metadata, the underlying metadata, but also to get credit. So that aspect too, the citation credit. And I would say sort of specifically another thing that we might have changed since you talked to Shelley, it's something we piloted recently, is that in order for the journals sort of to understand that something is a data software citation, or in this case, a sample, we're using sort of these bracketed descriptions. It's been an APA citation style for a while now, but we're going to use that as sort of an indicator to the people sort of doing copy editing, our specialist copy editors, to flag that and allow it to be ultimately indexed through that mechanism in Crossref, which is now available. It's taken a while for that to happen as well. So if you have a citation with that bracketed description, then that ultimately can help towards the citation credit and tracking. And that, I think here's one thing I just wanted to point to, is we have sort of common bracketed descriptions that we've referenced from this resource, so the DataCite schema. And there is actually one called physical object, which you might use, but I just wanted to point you to that, because that's also maybe part of your decision making too, is that you consider how these can be labeled. And then the other thing I wanted to mention too is that you can see on that site that we have information about what could be included in your availability statement. And I think some of the contextual information, it would be helpful to understand what you'd want to live within that availability statement too. The contextual information that helps readers sort of understand what's there before visiting, or some of the other conditions like licensing, and that is more maybe on the software side. But yeah, that I just wanted to point you to those resources, and I hope they help you. But yeah, we definitely want to integrate some of the work that you've been doing into our guidance. So
yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I probably missed a step in that introduction to say that. So we've got we're developing these guidelines, and then Shelley suggested that we model our guidelines off of the ones that AGU has recently finalized for the data and software for authors. And that's where a lot of these different facets that Chris is talking about are coming from, out of that document. And so we've restructured, and maybe, is it on the next slide? I don't see the link to it here, but I can put it in the chat. But our current version of the guidelines, which hopefully everyone has looked at, are using that example as a guide. And so then hopefully we'll be able to meet some of these same sort of concerns that are raised for data and software for the sample community. Val, did you want to add anything before we jump into the actual breakout activity?
I think we're good. I did just want to say that was chatting with Megan, and so I think that we're going to do random groups of 5 when we get to that.
Okay. Yeah, so basically, so now that we have this, this evolution has gone from, we had this idea of working on recommendations and guidelines. It's now evolved where we have a suggested template that we're going to use, and also a first adopter through AGU who wants to see this outcome. And so now we're using that structure and going to move forward with completing our text. We've been using the monthly calls to work on that, and at our first few calls, we've been reviewing the headlines and the categories that were presented in the data and software version to say, well, what works or is not applicable for samples and what is applicable for samples, and to add new sections. In this current document that I just put in the chat, you can see some of the notes and comments. We've been going through that. But one of the big questions that came up at our last meeting was, there's a section in those recommendations that are on defining or selecting your data repository. And so we've changed it to say, okay, selecting or defining your physical sample and data repository, the data related to the samples. And so our question for this community here in this breakout activity is, so what is the scope, or what should be the scope of these recommendations? Are we recommending the digital data repository for information about your samples? Is it the physical sample repository where you're housing the samples? Does it also include perhaps the related DOIs and data sets that derive from the samples? So what's within scope for this community, and what do they think is important to include within this guidelines? Once you make some evaluation as to what conditions are within scope, then we ask that you also discuss what some of those minimum metadata requirements might be for those different categories. And then also what other technical aspects or policies might come up within that topic. So we've got the metadata about the sample, the physical sample, and also the related materials about the samples as the 3 categories. I see Kirsten's raised her hand. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, the first bullet here about the repositories and you know, what recommendations are there? I think one of the points maybe to touch on in the discussions is also what are the requirements for those repositories? You know, we have much better sort of requirements established already for digital repositories, but are there requirements for physical sample repositories, or do they exist already? You know, if you want to make recommendations somehow towards repositories, I think you also need to establish sort of the criteria which are acceptable repositories.
Okay, just capturing that in the notes. But yeah, I think that definitely goes to our second bullet point of, so what are the minimum requirements then? And maybe those are, if they don't exist for those categories, what should be the minimal requirements? So not just what exists, but what should exist, I think is a good qualifier on that. Sorry, I was looking for the right word. So I'll put the link in the chat as well, but we've got breakout slides, and as Val just mentioned, we're going to put you randomly into 4. Are we doing 3 or 4 breakout groups?
I'm gonna create 4, but we'll leave 1 in the main room.
Okay.
So that way the recording has something going on in it during this time.
Okay, I've just put the link to the slides. They're also here in the chat, and they're also here on this slide. I'll stop presenting in just a second. But for the breakout activity, we're going to give you 30 minutes in it, and then we'll come back and check in. And depending on how the discussions are going, we either have a follow-up question or we'll let you focus in on this a little bit longer.
And just a reminder for this first breakout that each group has 2 slides. So there's one about the 3 kinds of scope options, and then the second one, thank you whoever is showing me this, and then the second one is about the policy options.
Quick check on the timing. Val, you had said 20 minutes and Sarah said 30 minutes. Can you clarify?
Oh, 30 then.
Oh, wait, what did we put in it? Let me look at the agenda.
Yeah, 30 and 20. I was just concerned that we were running behind, but let's stick with
Yeah, I guess maybe we should go with 20 since we are running a little bit behind, and then we can always, as we said, we were going to check in and give more time if needed for the topic.
All right, then I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. All right, so Adam, Val, Damien, and Charles, you'll be staying here in the main room. I didn't assign you to another room.
Awesome.
And I will stay with you if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're room 4 essentially.
Room 4.
All right. Here we go. I am just going to write down who all's in here. sure I've got all your names in here. All right, so is everybody doing okay on getting to the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I'm in the right, yeah, I'm in the right place.
All right, wait, which group are we?
We're four.
Group 4? That makes sense. Okay, sorry.
So I guess for digital data repositories, I guess the question is how much we want to reproduce from like what they've done for the data and software stuff, and whether it would be useful to reproduce what's likely to be useful because the software guidance might confuse people.
Oh, okay.
Like,
So
do you
maybe
think the software guidance is like too intense for a lot of physical sample scientists?
it would be very overwhelming, and that's a really good point. It's just really hard for folks to kind of figure out like, where does this apply to me and where does this not apply to me?
I'd like to do that without like reinventing the wheel.
So maybe like, so the next potential thing that we talked about, and Adam, I think you were there for this conversation about like making just a checklist for people to kind of boil it all down.
Yeah.
Maybe in this case, we could have something that's sort of a key to like what those little pieces are that we would need to tie in the digital data. But this is also like the generic question, first of all, is just, do we feel that these 3 boxes that we have here on this slide, are they all relevant to what we're proposing to create as sample citation guidelines? This was just a conversation that came up at one of our monthly calls that was pretty interesting, was that people were trying to wrangle with what actually is the scope of this.
I think
I'm all for all of it to expose my feelings on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of it was like physical sample repositories for geological samples, like don't really, like if you wanted to like deposit a sample in a repository, you can't really do that. You're sort of, you might have like your university might, although those collections have mostly been being shuttered, or a lot of those collections have been shuttered. And then there's like a few large repositories, but they're mostly for like agency samples or like large collections that people donate, but it's not like a place where you could say, well, I'm going to put my samples in this repository before I publish this paper. Like those resources don't exist, as far as I know. I'm sure someone here would know better than me, but there's just not a lot of good options. And so it's going to be like they're in a drawer in my office, or like they're in a cabinet in my office. And I think that's going to be like the vast majority if you get buy-in from like university scientists.
So just taking a step back, sorry, I've been like in and out of this session and also in and out of this effort more broadly. So your question here about, are each of the types of data shown here relevant to the scope of this section of the doc? I'm looking at the slide, right? That's what I'm supposed to be doing. So you're asking me if guidance on the digital data repository, the physical sample repository, and related data sets or DOIs are, I'm just trying to understand even the question. It says types of data below, but I'm confused what's the data.
Yeah. I know we were having a hard time wrangling with how to write that sentence, so it's probably still awkward. So if you take a look at the sample sharing guidance for authors template that we've been just kind of patching in the relevant pieces from the software guidelines.
Gotcha. Okay.
There is a section.
And I get there from the,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm really behind here. Review draft document. Gotcha. Or sample sharing guidelines.
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully that was helpful for any others who are just jumping into this.
Yes. The section that became very obviously relevant for us was called selecting your repository. And then the questions came from there, like, okay, are we talking about, Adam, like what you're saying, like where does it physically live? Which I think is important to say, even if it's like the basement of whatever academic building.
Yeah, I think we just wanted to be clear that it's like, you don't need to put your samples in a repository to publish a paper.
Yes.
Like that, and you just need to say where they are.
Yes, I think we could also, I don't know if it goes here, but also maybe like a list of resources for places where you might be able to, your samples could be relevant to a collection. I don't know.
It's hard because like, I know this is imagined as guidance given by the publishers, but who the ultimate authority is for you might be different. And
Right.
so, you know, like this is guidance coming from the publishers, but it's going to have a lot of caveats of like, but if your funding says this, or if, you know, you're employed by this place. So I wonder if like this guidance comes in multiple forms, like, you know, sort of, it is now broken out by, I don't know, section headers or whatever, but maybe there's also like a flow chart or a chronological set of things that might help folks. I don't know. My brain, sorry, is going lots of places right now, having looked at
It's a
this.
Friday.
It is a Friday, but I think, yeah, I think the question is too, you know, how many caveats are you going to put? How many sort of like this applies to everyone versus like this may not apply to you, and how much does that dilute like the broader message? I guess the balance between like 5 things we hold everyone to versus like 50 things where you have to figure out if they apply to you, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yes, and that's really important and something that I'm glad that you said.
The danger of this
My-
becoming
my-
an encyclopedia
Yes,
or a glossary
Two
versus,
pages.
yeah.
yes, because
Um,
it needs to be something that's an achievable ask. Even
So I
though
think-
I want it to be like, you know, oh, there's answers, but you know, it needs to be, what is the minimum things that we're asking of people? Yes.
So I guess what we've kind of come down to is that physical samples should be in a repository, but this is kind of not really uncovered, but kind of made apparent that a lot of researchers just keep them, like you guys said, in a drawer. So maybe we should figure out a way to give them at least an option to or like guidelines of how to put their samples in a repository so that they can actually be listed for this.
Yeah, and so there's another header which we may or may not keep called selecting your repository, and I was hoping that like maybe I don't know, I was envisioning something like that where
And I know that's hard. I know Adam said before, like the reality is most people aren't going to be able to find a repository unless they sort of had already prearranged that or that was understood. But I also, there's a part of me that's like, I don't want to let them off the hookies. I want to make it sound like it almost is required until I have to
Yes.
tell them it's okay that you didn't figure that out.
So- It's actually interesting, and I guess this would just provide an example of things actually getting stored in a repository. Is here at the ICE Core facility, our kind of neighbors or who we share our office space with is the Core Research Center.
Mhm.
And while they also have a lot of government drilled cores in one part of the warehouse, they also have a section where scientists kind of just pay them to have a space there where they store their samples. So it's like for USGS scientists, it's almost like their own little repository where they can keep the samples that they have or, you know, need a space to store. So maybe, you know, people could kind of take a leap off that and like, you know, pay for space at a warehouse, like a publicly available warehouse. I don't know how the logistics of that would work, but, you know.
And maybe it does say, sorry, Adam, I'll just really quickly say like, you know, your funding agreement takes precedence here, but at the minimum, you must do these things, which is what Adam said before about, you know, tell us where samples are, whether or not they're in a repository. I don't know. Sorry, go ahead, Adam.
No, I think like having like a pretty descriptive, like it should be descriptive at the time of when the paper is published, like the samples are available from like the University of blah or whatever. And then you could provide like, if you are interested in permanent, like finding a permanent archive, here are some resources.
Yeah.
But I think it's like even like when the Smithsonian absorbs collections, it's all like end career stuff, except for like the scientists who work in the building. So it's like you get a big batch of samples all at one time.
And everybody thinks their samples are Smithsonian quality, but that's not
we have
usually
like
the case.
vanishingly
Yeah.
tiny, like we have less and less.
Yeah, I
Like there's
know.
no space, like all the space for the next 30 years is like spoken for, and we don't really have a ton of room to expand. We need to think about that. But like they just are geological repositories. They talked about making the Smithsonian a geological repository like way back early in like CSAR IETA days, and it was like, it's impossible. Like, we don't have the staff or the money or the space.
For
We
sure.
don't, and like, do we need to keep everything forever? Like, that's the other.
Yeah, I feel like that whole other side of like the decision tree of what needs to be kept and who might be able to keep it, like that puts a lot of pressure on a lot of other people to figure out those decisions. The more descriptive we make this.
And we have the opposite problem where it's like, now we're like, what is not worth keeping? Like, what in the collection now? And that's like a deaccessioning question, which museums are very hesitant to do, but will need to be addressed at some point. Because a lot of this stuff just didn't have data. We just don't have the metadata that you would need to be like truly scientifically useful for a lot of the collection. And so then it's like, how do you balance historical interest? But that's like a me problem. I had one question about this slide. Is the yellow box, is that like sample metadata? Because I realized I was looking at that and thinking that it was like data sets that are associated with the sample, but I think the purple box.
Yes, good
I
question.
asked that question before.
Okay, I missed that.
Sorry if I
I think
No.
Yeah, I must have heard that and just like, I got confused because I was definitely looking at that as like, this is the sample data.
Yeah, so the I know, I feel like this one is kind of like pointing at a very direct answer in my mind is, you know, where are the metadata for your physical sample? So this is basically saying like making a plug for getting IGSNs.
Yeah.
We call it
And so, like,
digital
where's the
metadata.
where's the,
Or like sample, or like, I guess we don't want to use sample because everyone's really like a lot madder about that word than I am.
Can we say metadata though? Because I trip up on that all the time
I hate
too.
it. I don't even know. I think when people talk about data about samples, they always say sample metadata. I don't really know why. I think it's because it's not like analyses, but I get tripped up on that too. I can't.
But this is going to trip up every researcher out there if we, as people who know metadata quite well,
Why is it
are tripping
metadata
on
and
that.
not data? I don't know.
yeah,
I can't
Sample
keep-
information repository, like yeah, I feel like there has to be a much more plain language way of saying it.
I sometimes call it like the location data. I don't know. Or like,
Spatial
Descriptive-
data.
The collection or like storage.
I don't know. I mean, when we, you know, for example, I work with sediment cores, we give everybody a metadata sheet and then they provide the metadata for their samples, which means different things to different people.
I feel like
It sounded like it should have been data.
descriptive information repository. Like I'm like coming up with all these other words that I don't know. I don't know the answer. Okay, so I'm seeing this chronological thing again. Like I'm kind of seeing this bucket of like things you do, you know, before publication, things you do after publication. I don't know. I'm just trying to sort this in a different way in my brain. So anyways, file that for later. Ignore me.
I think like having, so the way the data guidelines were set up was they had like best, better, like best, good, and then like okay. And I think we'll probably have to do that. And like, so best is register your samples,
Yep.
IGSN or persistent identifier. And then like okay is like just like use your collector numbers, and then people will never, like, it'll just be difficult to resolve your samples uniquely.
Oh,
Like if
there's
they move, it'll be hard to track them. Because that's the other thing that's nice about the IGSN is it provides the current archive.
the problem with, I think even still a lot of, especially like, you know, the older researchers, they just keep it on paper and like their sample metadata. And what happens when their office gets cleared out and that, you know, big folder full of metadata just kind of gets lost in the shuffle, then those samples don't have anything. So maybe, you know, suggesting that universities and research institutions have maybe a workflow of whenever you take, you know, location or spatial data, you have to have it uploaded to like a digital spreadsheet within X amount of months after collecting the data. I don't know, just some kind of, you know, way for them to do that.
So
That's
we're
the funding
doing
has that.
something like that here where we encourage folks to, we have a space in our basement where we can put like working collections for local researchers. And we haven't totally implemented that yet, but we're making a plan where it's like, if you don't give us these spreadsheets, they don't come in the door kind of thing. But not everybody has that kind of space and staffing to make that a possibility.
Especially for backlogs of samples, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, because And I don't know, yeah, it's tricky, especially for those samples where people think I can just drop those off and it'll magically get taken care of.
So one thing that's coming to mind here is, there are real experts who can help with some of these things. So like we're consolidating it all into this document, but I think in the act of doing that, we're kind of making ourselves sound like the experts, or making, Chris and Shelley, who are actually the point of contact for this document, but pushing hard that like your friendly neighborhood repository curator should be your best friend early on in working with samples, or metadata, Sarah, or what I used to do. I think we need to make it really clear that like we're giving you guidance here and they are helping us to shape it, but they are actually the best points of contact.
If that person exists.
Right, if that person exists.
I guess like having like a general like community, like having something where people could like ask questions.
That isn't just Chris and Shelley as the repository or publisher folks.
Yeah.
But then you have to have people.
The data help desk? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out.
Like, how would you, like, somewhere you could like direct people, and then like it was like, I don't know, a Slack or something, or like a message board where like multiple people could respond and like people knew to check it. But then like, how do you market that to your audience? Which is.
But I think it's broader. It's something we do push at the data help desk. Also, it's something about how engaging with these folks, just like engaging with, your journal editors, and finding out what's required ahead of time, engaging early on is the best thing that you can do. I think it's not a specific pointing to anyone. It's just the knowledge that like, if those people exist, they are resources for you, and they want to help. Having been in that role before, as you know, Adam, that like just letting people know that we existed for that purpose, I think still needs to be done.
Maybe in like having an FAQ, a frequently asked questions section, you list some curators that know this very well that aren't them, just contact information for them, ones that agree to it, obviously. And
Right.
so you can actually like shoot them an email, or there's software where you can like type in a question like on a little chat board, and it'll send them a question. And so maybe they check it once a week and answer people's questions. Something like that makes it easy to access for people who need more information on it.
Yeah, and I like that resource. I don't know, Val, is that you putting that in there? The domain repositories link, whoever put that in on the related data set side. I think that's the level of what I'm talking about is.
Yes.
I think that's a really good page.
Too is like, is this a place where like, I don't know. It's something that I think about here because people approach us and say, do you take this data? And it's like, I don't know, who knows best what the answer to that is. And I've thought maybe like the library here, there are a lot of the data folks there that might be a good resource. I don't know.
Yeah.
If that's universally true or not.
Well, and it's another thing where funding sources often help to dictate where you're supposed to put stuff. So, so we have about 30 seconds. Well, a minute and 30 seconds left, just so you know.
We also have another, or is this next slide 9, supposed to be one that we do in this time period as well? Or
Ideally. But we should probably say what our feedback is. Do we want more time to like hone in on this for the next breakout, or do we want to move on to like the next bit that Sarah and I had potentially planned if we were done with this?
What is the?
It was to work on the checklist for the authors. Like, what are the things?
I don't even know what to do with this next slide.
It was a question that someone had asked us.
To me, this is more of like the help desk stuff that we're talking about, where people need like specific guidance for like mapping their data to like a given, like prepping their data to go into CSAR or something.
Yeah, this reminds
me. Like that's going to be way beyond scope for a document. Like you'd have to like, this is like where you need to figure out like who you can direct these people to. Like people with questions.
You have to set up some kind of, option so that they can actually like, rather than just this person getting a bunch of emails, maybe they get like a, you know, it's like a chat room. So you'd have to do all that back end work with it too.
Yeah, like it's like I think that's the where you have like multiple people checking and it's just like a discussion, or it's like, you know, GitHub discussion or something, like any sort of community, something that's available where it's not like doesn't fall on one person to answer, but like people know that it's there and people are checking it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm also curious if any part of this guidance changes based on which journal this guidance is coming from, or if it all stays at the level of just AGU journals. I mean, I know there are some things that wouldn't change, but.
Yeah, because if you have different data citation guidelines in.
I mean, it'd be a lot to maintain it at that level, but in terms of what you recommend, some of the recommendations might be different.
Hello. So
Hello.
we wanted to check in. How is it going within the groups?
We were a little
Very
bit
well.
confused about exactly what it was we were supposed to be doing.
Yeah, unfortunately, with only 2 chairs here, we didn't have a moderator for every session or breakout. So maybe that's a good note for us to take away, that we should have recruited some additional people we knew were going to be here to help be moderators for each breakout.
We wound up kind of listing out things that we felt like were important in each of those categories when selecting a repository. And I'm not sure if that's what we think it'll be helpful.
Yeah, because the main thing was, first, here are 3 topic areas that were discussed within the group. Are they in scope? And if they are in scope, yeah, please share some ideas of what should go in there. So that sounds good. I guess the question is, the session itself has 30 more minutes, and we wanted to have 20 minutes for another breakout or continuing this discussion, and then we have 10 minutes for closing and wrap up. So with this next 20 minutes, do you want to go back into what you were just talking about, or should we show you what the other topic was?
Let's have a look at the other topic. I'd vote for that.
I vote for that, and I vote for not doing it in breakouts, but with the full group, because I don't think it's that huge.
Let me find the slide. Okay, so for the next topic, we wanted to go through and review the structure of the guidelines that we've got. So that we've done this a bit in the monthly calls, but as I mentioned earlier, we took the data and software guidelines, copied it, and then just started to replace the headings with the appropriate titles for what they would be for physical samples, or cutting out sections that weren't related to physical samples, and then adding topics that weren't there before. So we thought it would be good to have that check-in with people who hadn't been attending the monthly calls to say, does this look accurate as far as the headings and what should be included? Did we miss anything? And then also take some time to say, Adam added an author checklist, which we thought was a great addition, and sort of give some opportunity to look at that as well, since it was new to the document. So that's the second breakout topic. So now that we've got an introduction to that, do we want to do that as a group, or do we want to go back into the first breakout topic for more time? Okay, so hearing no strong opinions for going back to the first topic, let's just do this second topic then as a group. And maybe we'll try and keep it to only the next 12 minutes so that we can give more time for closing, because I think when Val and I were looking at the timing, we were concerned we wouldn't have enough time for all the topics we wanted to address in the closing. But I'm going to go ahead and bring up the, let's see, the sample sharing guidelines. And so this is the document. I can put this in the chat as well so that everyone can join in. But from a high level, I wish there was a way, is there a way to do this on the side? Yeah, so from a high level view, you can see we've got considerations for publication related to samples and sample related data. guidelines for research primarily based on physical samples, a section on selecting your repository, which is what that previous breakout was focused on, some guidelines for what should happen during peer review, and a section on what happens when the paper is accepted, and finally, availability statements, templates, and checklists. These are the main topic areas, again, that were pulled from that software and data guidelines. There anything, looking at this document and these headings, is there anything that's coming out of this that you're thinking is missing or maybe is not appropriate for samples? And there's also more finer grained headings underneath that as well. Just scrolling through the document while you guys think.
Sarah, just a quick comment. I have also linked to other resources that we have in here. Like, so we have a page on useful repositories, and that could be something that can be built out. And then there was a checklist comment, and I shared a checklist that we had developed that you could potentially use too. So there are links in there.
Okay, thank you.
I'm curious what folks think about the defining previously selecting your physical sample and data repository header, and partially because I think it could be really helpful to tease apart like what is going to be put in a repository versus what is going to be like, and how that's different than regular data deposit. Because I think like one of the recommendations you might want to put in here is like document your samples with IGSN or register your samples and get those identifiers. And I don't know if that I don't know how much that overlaps with the previous section, if that makes sense.
No, but I guess it's a good way we could use this as a method of structuring the report outs from those groups, because we did skip that step just because I think of time constraints.
Okay.
But yeah, what did you guys think about this section?
About the repository, you mean?
Yeah, we're defining or selecting what was in scope, what's not in scope. What should the title be for the section?
I mean, the challenge, you know, as we discussed in our breakout group, is that there are so few real repositories for samples, right? So you're putting a burden on the researchers you're putting a request on the researchers that they're going to have a very hard time fulfilling. You know, the institutions, the universities where researchers work are so far not really willing to provide infrastructure for long-term archiving of samples. And so I mean, I see this as a great way to push for, you know, better policies that tell universities to archive these samples, but it's not there yet. And what are people going to do if, you know, probably Adam is going to get 1 million requests then to accommodate samples at the Smithsonian, or, you know, for Marine Corps, obviously, you know, it's not as difficult because there are some, you know, repositories funded by NSF, for example, to store those cores. But I see this as a bit of a challenge, you know, that for researchers and authors to fulfill.
Yeah, I think if you frame it as if your sample came from a repository or lives in a physical repository, follow these steps for describing that, but framing it as an optional thing as opposed to please go get the Smithsonian to take your rocks.
Yeah, and I was a little confused here too, because a lot of times your funding agreement will dictate what you need to do, and I was trying to juggle in my mind like the guidance coming from publishers versus the guidance you may be getting elsewhere. And, you know, maybe there's a better, or are there levels of ways you can comply with this, but where we're not letting people off the hook and saying like, you just don't have to do this, but still, yeah, leaves room for a variety of answers.
But like, I think this section primarily be descriptive. Like, if the rocks are, if you're storing the rocks in a cabinet in your office, just be like, contact me for the samples. Because exactly what Kirsten said, like these repositories don't really exist, at least for a huge chunk of like petrology and mineralogy.
I mean, this seems like, yeah, in a lot of cases, yeah, there won't be a physical repository available, but the critical thing would be that if you are getting any kind of analytical work done on the sample, that all the results are reported with the same identifier. And that, you know, that's the critical practice from a data integration point of view. Having it in a repository is only critical if there's some idea that this is a valuable enough specimen that somebody might want to access it in the future. And I think that, you know, cores, you know, lunar samples, things like that. It's the policy about what needs to be in a physical repository has to somehow have a value, you know, value judgment associated.
Yeah.
Wasn't there another? Sorry.
Chris raised his hand. Did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, it's just what I think Adam said about contact me. These rocks are in my office. It sort of rings. It's similar to like data available upon request and contact me, and you know, right. in some ways they, you know, they have your information, right, as an author on there to contact you. I think the point, you know, maybe to focus on here is what we sort of guide our authors to doing is, you know, trying to guide them in the best possible way to sort of direct their question to you, right? Like what, you know, what should they specifically request? And, you know, it's like trying to reduce the amount of time for, you know, in the data sense, right? Like trying to reduce the amount of time where like, don't just drop them on a homepage, guide them to, you know, the place where they need to find and the data exactly. But like in this case, like guide them to, you know, putting together that request more specifically or something like that. Because yeah, it's not in a repository, but you know, maybe there's some additional things that they can do to sort of speed the process up and make it more efficient. I
mean, the interesting question here, I think, Chris, is will publishers require open accessibility of a sample, a fair sample, basically? Because if that is something that the publishers require because of reproducibility for the data that were generated, then funding agencies will need to change and universities will need to change to make those samples available in order to comply. You know, for now, I think the first step is to actually make the metadata about the sample available, which is the landing page of a unique identifier that you want to implement. But that next step towards accessibility of the actual physical object needs to be pushed forward. And if, you know, publishers, just like we did in Coptis, you know, getting people together and say, this is what we really need in order to make data reusable and accessible, then, you know, that's a very important community demand to bring forward.
Oh, completely agree. It's just we work in shades of gray. And so, you know, I think that specific question I was responding to, but yeah, for the most part, we try to, you know, have sort of a streamlined response, or, you know, is that exactly what you described is trying to make all this more fair, right? And use sort of these mechanisms, like you say, you know, for capturing the metadata for citability. But, you know, again, there's shades of gray, shades of gray, and we try to work on all those sort of exceptions.
Charles, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, it just kind of brought up the question in my mind, then what would the minimum requirements of fairness be for these samples to be at least usable or findable? Because that's what we're really trying to define in the end, is like, what is the minimum amount people would have to do to be able to make these samples fair enough to be found?
thank you, because that kind of brings it back to that's what we intended with the breakout discussions. And I feel like that kind of got lost a bit, was that we weren't saying we're going to give recommendations on what actual repository you should use, because that can't necessarily be possible and might be dependent on, again, your funding agency. But yeah, thank you, Charles. That's really great.
Can I make a suggestion? So what I was hearing, what I hear you saying and what I heard others saying is that we want to give more guidance on the metadata repository than we do on the physical repository. So I put in the chat, can we decouple those? Can we make them separate headers or separate parts of the document? It sounds like, and it looks like what's already here is mostly about the metadata repositories anyways, I think.
Yeah, that's why I was putting that in the notes, but I think that's a good point, and that some of the information, and we discussed this in our breakout group. Let me look at the notes real quick. So about the repository might be more related to methods for identifying places for storing, but that it really goes to where you're at, and that it's some of the, again, what Charles was saying, some of that, this is what you should think, why you should think about it, and what you should know about it in that concept without necessarily being direct recommendations. But let's see, I put this in the notes, but I'll make it a comment on this to decouple the two things too. Sorry, my brain was trying to take notes and lead at the same time. I apologize if I'm getting a little rambly.
Okay, Sarah, you're doing great. And okay, sorry, I have one more thought. I wonder if, and sorry, does anybody else want to raise their hand? I shouldn't talk too much.
No, I don't think anyone else has their hand raised.
So I wonder too, you know, like we talked about this in our group, the importance of this being really short and concise and clear, like Charles was saying. But it does sound like we are getting it. We have a lot of things we want to tell people. So is there an appendix to that? Or how do we make a judgment call about the things we want to kind of ramble on about versus what's really, really, really important?
Just gonna second to Megan and say that that's what we did with the extended guidance versus the shortened guidance, is to say what do we want to put up front in front of the authors first, and then, you know, the extended part is where we get into more information, like you say. So supporting you on that one.
And that might be something that leads to what our next activities are. So maybe we can't be exhaustive here, but we can put the critical items into the guidelines. And then for our next activity as a cluster, maybe we pick one of those topics and go into it more deeply. And I do think there's probably also other groups working on some of these things. Taka brought up a few examples in our group of what the ocean's best practices, and also DISCO, and where other groups might be, not, I don't want to say solving these topics, but might be coming up with good recommendations that are more detailed and can get into the more nitty gritty than this group is capable of doing. Andrea, you've got your hand raised?
Yeah, I think, like, so you'd mentioned what are maybe topics for the cluster to get into next. I'm looking through the like thinking back to this, like, how do you choose your digital repository? I think there's a lot of like very specific guidance that you could give related to repositories that are set up more for physical samples within the earth sciences. And I know it's going to vary depending on domain, but that might be a good place to dive into next, to try to help guide people to ones that they might not know of, but are definitely good for this material, and then go into the guidance for general repositories and things like that. And I think also, like, it sounds like the headers are getting, you know, finalized. I think it'll be like, I don't know. Well, it looks like you're going in a good direction of like then starting to farm out people to work on different sections or something.
As I say, you set us up perfectly. I'm going to go back to the slides to go to our back to our next steps and wrap up. Let's see. Let's jump to that just because we're on it. I hope that's all right with everyone. But we wanted to talk about rest. Sorry, but part of that too was looking for volunteers to say, is there a section that you want to work on? I feel like I'm messing things up a bit. Sorry, Val. Well, didn't we have a slide with a timeline? Oh, here it is. there's. Okay, so looking at the timeline for this document, we wanted to, so we're working on it now, continue working on it in February. We'd like to have a final meeting in March then to say like, we've got a good rough draft going. And then at that point, start sharing it for amongst others for exposure. I'll bring this up later, but there's first within ESIP and other groups maybe outside of the cluster. Then also there's the RDA has a physical samples interest group that we might share in their session at their next meeting. Then the different communities like iSamples or Sampling Nature that have other connections to others outside of the earth sciences that are connecting with like biology and archaeology, just for feedback of what other communities think. With then a goal of then continuing to work on those things in April and then hopefully having a draft done in May. So we can get feedback on the draft in June and then present a final version at the ESIP summer meeting or July meeting this summer in the US. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid using the term summer, sorry, Leslie. But given this sort of timeline for how we want to move forward in the future, does anyone here want to take lead on perhaps a section of the guide or want to volunteer to help, maybe not identify the section you want to take lead on now, but wants to commit to helping get this process done and work on the document moving forward?
I want to help. I teach during the samples cluster meeting time, but I do want to help.
And we can revisit that time. It's probably good to do that every quarter. So I'm going to put that as an action item to revisit. Oops, sorry, wrong computer. To revisit the meeting time for the cluster.
I'm also happy to help, but I had a question. Are we going to try to share this with like specimen scientists, like people who work with specimens, and like where would that fit into this timeline? Because I think we're going to have some blind spots in terms of what's going to confuse people.
Yeah, and where do you think that would be good, earlier rather than later? Like once we get a draft in March?
Yeah, maybe after the exposure draft. But...
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry. Get some maybe do the technical commentary from like the ESIP, like those three groups, and after that,
Okay.
April, May. I guess the question is like, how do you find like where do you solicit that feedback?
Well, that's kind of if you look at the second dot point. So we were thinking of exposing this to the RDA physical samples group, which is international and does move beyond earth sciences.
Are those people mostly, oh, sorry.
Oh, go on.
Are they mostly data people or are they like scientists who work on physical samples?
They're a mixed bag. But
well, that could be where the spinach, we do a spinach poster on this.
Yeah.
Would
Spinach
that be a community?
People, spinach won't get you researchers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good. I'd like to get some, I think the museum community is probably good. I know they're interested in this topic, or we're interested in this topic. I'm talking about people who are like using this document and trying to publish papers based on it, like what's going to confuse them.
So Chris Erdman, what's your experience seeing you've AGU has done those for data for software for models. When you got those templates up, what was your exposure plan?
It's improved. And just like I think what Aaron actually references here in the chat is that people actually proactively link to sections now and specifically ask us about things. But it's been improving. You do have to like sort of socialize it and do some outreach and training because, you know, I think the other part of this is that we have heard that it's a very long document. You know, like that there's been some hesitancy around that, but then people are very favorable when they go to that sort of initial cover page, intro page, which sort of refines things down to what you were talking about, which is what are the most important things for them to know about and do. They appreciate that. So it has, we've seen improvements, definitely. If that helps, Leslie.
Yes. So Charles, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I was just gonna pose the question of how are you gonna gather this feedback? Is it gonna be like a survey? Are they gonna be like meetings similar to this? Are you gonna do, you know, one-on-one meetings with these different, you know, whether it be one of the scientists who'd actually be using these guidelines? Like, how do you all plan to do that?
I think that's about sharing it with select, I don't know. Or at least initially, I like the idea of, you know, casting a call for feedback on the document, but maybe like share it with a few specific folks in a variety of domains. See if they
Yeah.
can give it a look.
So again, the with the RDA physical samples cluster, they have a process where like we could put it on, like it's got 10,000 members. We could put it on, you know, expose it through that. And that would invite, yeah, wider participation. But yeah, I mean, if there are specimen networks, anything, you know, it's just a matter of finding out what's available for us to ask and seek comment from.
Yeah, and I
Because
do want to
again-
highlight some things that have been brought up in the chat too, examples of perhaps a working group within this to focus on that. So those, maybe someone who doesn't want to necessarily help with the content could help with that outreach and vetting. And Megan has suggested both the help desk as a possibility to get input, and Andrew has suggested AG or GSA as posters as well.
What about seeing if we could get the AGU editors to send a copy of the draft to people who submit papers that have sample-based data and say AGU is considering adopting these kinds of guidelines. What do you think? To somebody who's actually, you know, submitted a paper and would have, you know, in the future would have to use the guidelines. They might be more motivated to look at them.
That's a really cool idea. I like that. It's getting positive support in the chat too.
I don't know. I kind of like, because having gone through this with the editors and seeing how the sausage is being made, you know, like where people are just kind of like, let me get through this process. Let me get through this process. You know, I think they're more focused on that versus the guidance. I think you have to get them in through a different channel, maybe.
But if you told them that you might be, you know, look at this, the next time you submit a paper, you might need to do this. What do you know, give them a chance to get the blowback then.
Would we be able to do something in EOS?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Kirk is always looking for submissions to EOS from the informatics section. This might be something we could use that angle on.
We could solicit feedback through a survey or something like that if we wrote like a small little article. We might get more feedback than we want.
Well,
I guess that's better sooner than later.
yeah, that's what I'm arguing. You're either going to get it in one hit, or as people start to be forced to implement it because of some publisher policy, you'll start to get the gripes like a slow drip coming through, and they'll be harder to deal with.
Okay, so I think given that we've got 3 minutes left, I'm just gonna like power run through some of the next slides. I think the answer to this question is probably yes. That do we want to take this to advertise in the physical samples or the Earth, Space, Environmental Science? Is that right? Interest group?
Yep.
So we'll take that as a yes. We've already, I think some of this is already bridging on to who should we seek for reviewers. And I think we'll have that as we can have follow-up discussions at the monthly telecons or maybe over email about that. But just as a future planning note in the last few minutes, that like I said, we want to use this for get this done, hopefully, fingers crossed, by the July ESIP meeting so that we can then talk about some next steps for the cluster and what the cluster might want to focus on next. And unfortunately, I don't think we have time to discuss some of what that might be at this meeting. But our next telecon is currently scheduled for February 22nd, but I'll send out an email and a poll to reschedule that to see what works best so that we can get those of you who would like to be properly engaged in the meetings, and also reflecting on our global spread and the time zone for that But in the meantime, if you're not already, please sign up for a listserv, and then you'll get that either calendar update or doodle poll to figure out a new time through that method. But we hope you can all join us with that. And in this last minute, does anyone have anything that they want to share or to throw out as far as what we can say as the takeaways from this session? Or what did you take away from this session?
Reaffirmed that data citation is hard, but there's a lot of good progress towards it for this case.
No, data citation is hard. Data sample citation is even harder.
And Megan's comments here in the chat. A lot of people care about this topic and there's a lot left to do. That's very true. Yes. Communication, super key. And tying in the physical samples with the repository. I mean, I know we've all known that, but just it's important, but difficult.
Yeah, that is a major thing of like what Kristen was talking about, like the need to push and advocate for building physical sample repositories. Yeah, that it's hard enough to build cyber infrastructure, so much more when it takes up space,
Yeah,
or substantial space. Yeah.
I think how this information is presented to these people is going to be really important, and that's become apparent, because if it's too much, then no one's going to want to help work on it.
Yeah, where you can get lost in it because there's just too much.
Exactly. If there's, you know, a 55-page document, no one's going to want to read through that whole thing.
I think that's a good point for us to remember as going through these guidelines, is that we might have lots of opinions and lots of things to say, but we need to be able to be concise so that they can be picked up and utilized.
and realistic. And I think that's why it's really important that we get eyes from, you know, researchers on like how they feel about it.
What Megan said in the chat is really good too, is that
Yeah.
we could just put everything down first and then spend a lot of time going through and shortening it and just picking out the most essential points. That way everything is there at first.
Yeah,
That's how we did it too. We had an editor just go through it and refine it like crazy. Just try having multiple editors try and edit this thing though. That's an experience. So
I really like the idea of having an extended edition.
Oh man. Well, we're now a few minutes over, so I thank you all for sticking around. And this has been really, really awesome. Great to see the discussion and engagement and the director's cut version. Yes. The cat grill. But also to see such passion on these topics. Like I know Val and I struggled a bit with what do we want to make the focus of the session so we could get the most out of the community. And I felt a few times where maybe we didn't quite hit the mark, but I think in the end, we really had such good engagement and good structure from all of you that this went very well. So thank you again for attending and for contributing.